Everybody, to the latest CTO Craft Bites. Today we're going to look at the challenge of visibility in complex organizations. If it's your first time here at the CTO Craft Bites, I can tell you a little bit more about CTO Craft in general. It's a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world. I know Andrew's based in the US, in New York today. Hopefully it's very Christmassy over there for you. It focuses on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. There's lots of great community members, probably 6,000 plus now, and they also do one-to-one coaching and mentoring and events like this. Oh, and there's a fantastic Slack community as well. So I'm Anna Dick. I'm a CTO consultant and mentoring. I'm based in Manchester, UK. It's not snowing, but it is cold and slightly wet here. But welcome, Andrew. Thanks for joining us. You lead Code Climate's customer organization. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, I will. I'm still warming up from being outside on my walk to the office this morning. As you mentioned, I am in New York, and it is. It doesn't look Christmassy, but it feels Christmassy outside. So, but I've been with Code Climate since July, so coming into my 6-month period, and a lot of my previous experience has been focused on helping leaders at really large organizations within the United States federal government, with some of the Fortune 500 companies that are headquartered in the US, as they think about going through their digital transformation, which is the hot buzzword for several years ago. So had a background in product management, actually building the software, and then moved into more of the leadership pairing around how to structure teams and how to structure orgs, before coming to Code Climate, have an opportunity to actually take a software solution to measure the effectiveness of all of those things that I had been doing for the first parts of my career. So it's an exciting opportunity to kind of marry some of my previous interests with a software solution now.
Yeah, nice. Love that. That's some great experience. Okay, so just to the audience, just before we start, if you want to ask any questions, please click the ask a question button. We will kind of monitor it. If we can pick up on anything that's relevant to what we're speaking on and we are speaking about, we notice in time, we'll try and answer in line. If not, we're going to have time at the end for questions, so don't worry, we won't miss out. Okay, cool. So let's get into it. So when leading large or distributed teams, I guess it can be really difficult to gain that critical visibility necessary to operate well. You've worked with engineering companies, leaders of all organizations and sizes, but what challenges do you see with those larger, more complex organizations?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because visibility means a bunch of different types of things. And as you get into larger, more complex organizations, the types of things that you might want to have visibility into just don't exist in smaller organizations. And you may have scenarios where, I've worked with organizations that had budgets allocated towards different groups and different teams and different initiatives, but they didn't have headcount allocated to any to some of those. So there was line item budget, but there was no actual work being done there. The people who saw or who oversaw both of those different line items never spoke to each other. They didn't see the complete picture. They only saw their slice. So the topic of visibility, as it overlaps with complexity, is really, it gets into how many different handshakes need to exist between the number of people needed to see the whole picture. It just increases exponentially with the larger an organization is and the more intricate the structure is. Smaller company, you don't have so much of those issues. You can just go walk down the hall and ask Janet. But in a larger organization, you may not even know who the Janet is that you need to ask the question for.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely experienced that, like doing quite a few years in startups where everybody's in one room. You can kind of just shout and the communication is really kind of open, and then moving to more corporate organizations. And you're right, there's so many different silos and teams and people doing much more specific specialist roles. Yeah, and not necessarily knowing about each other as well sometimes is an interesting one. So typically, how are those teams set up? Does it make a difference to the extent of the issues of visibility, how those larger teams are set up?
It does, and I've seen a number of different models. When you specifically talking about engineering, there's I think a world that many of us are familiar with, where you have the business as one entity, one side of the organization, and you have technology as a different side of the organization, a different set of teams. That's a common pattern that I see less of today than I did a decade ago, but it's still very pervasive in some of the larger organizations. But there have been a big push, over the past 5 or so years of my career to try to bring those two worlds together in the form of like a balanced product team, which solves some challenges, introduces a whole set of new challenges as well. But the organizational structure um, maps to how the teams are incentivized and how they're measured, which also helps map towards back to that visibility point from earlier, is if we have multiple functions sitting within one team that are all caring about the same type of outcome, you have multiple perspectives in one track rather than kind of the siloed views of in each individual responsibility. So as it solves for visibility specifically, I think um, there's evidence that points to bringing those two worlds together into more of a like cohesive, balanced team approach does make a really big difference in terms of visibility.
Yeah, fabulous. I mean, I guess generally visibility seems like a relatively simple concept and we all want it, but so why is it so hard to achieve?
Well, I mean, if I have a product management background, Anna, your background has been more on the technical side. So if someone were to ask the two of us, what do you want visibility into? We're going to have two different answers.
I
So
think that's changed over the years, though. I think moving to more towards kind of product engineering side of things and understanding that actually just having the tech over here and just having the products or the business over here, you're right, you don't necessarily achieve the right outcomes.
and for the organizations that still stick into that mindset of keeping things separate, like I think the big challenge there is what is it that each individual group is wanting to have visibility into. For the groups that are more unified in that project or product engineering type mindset, there may be alignment in what you need visibility into, but instrumenting that is challenging. There's a combination of some of the fluffy human-oriented things that it's hard to put a quantitative number on, but even on the things that are more measurable, like how long does it take to run a test suite? That's probably something that be good to have some insight into. Um, Instrumenting that takes time and it takes effort and it needs to be prioritized against other things. So the
Mm.
concept of like everyone can agree, yes, these are the 12 things we really want to be able to have a regular pulse on. We may not agree that it's worth pausing some other work or deprioritizing other work in order to get the time needed to make that work visible for us.
Yeah, okay. So I think, what are there different areas, I guess, that you think that would focus the conversation around in terms of what are the top kind of 4 priority areas that you'd want to dig a
Yeah, I
little
think
deeper into?
sure. So some of the things that I have seen kind of come up regularly in organizations that I've worked with and in conversations that I've been having. A big one is kind of the source of bottlenecks. Where are bottlenecks coming from? Do we have any visibility into that? The second would be not necessarily a source of visibility, but a way to solve the visibility problem is this concept of standardization. I have many thoughts on standardization and how that applies or maybe shouldn't apply in contexts. Um, and you have the concept of, well, what does a healthy team look like? How do we know if a team is healthy? How do we know if we are creating an environment for a team to be healthy? It's kind of the third thing. And I would say, you said four. Number four for me would be we'll say we have a productive engineering team, productive engineering organization. Do we have any insight or visibility into how that actually impacts the business that we're trying to operate? So I think those four things, if I had to whittle it down to a list, would be where I would think to spend some time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Four great topics. I've definitely witnessed or experienced being involved in something with all of those. So from a bottleneck perspective, I guess there's lots of different bottlenecks. I think one that I've seen quite recently was around governance side of things. In terms of that, another one is potentially testing. Like, what are the kind of bottlenecks that you're observing or not observing, I guess, in terms if we're saying that we're not able to actually see them, maybe till it's too late?
Yeah, I think governance is a topic that I could talk for a very long time on, having spent a lot of time working with the U.S. federal government and some of their agencies. You know, they are bureaucracy and process by default. But there are some really interesting sources of bottlenecks, and I kind of think of them in two categories. There's, for myself as a leader, what decisions have I made that downstream have created unintended bottlenecks? Things like, maybe I had set a policy where only the most senior person on the team can do code reviews, or only someone with a certain level of seniority on a team could do code reviews. Well, that process is probably not a huge bottleneck if there are 3 folks on the team at that level, but if there's only one person on the team at that level, everything runs through her.
Yeah. Or if they're on holiday, or if 2 of those are on holiday,
Exactly.
there's lots of moving options. Yeah.
And that ends up kind of creating some other unintended behaviors where, now instead of optimizing for smaller batch work size, if I know that I'm only going to be up in line once a week to have my code reviewed, I'm going to throw more code into the review so that I can get that review passed. So that one decision on my part that was like, oh yeah, we should just have people that are level 3 and above do code reviews, has unintended trickle down effects there that do create some bottlenecks. Then you have the bottlenecks that are kind of enforced by the teams themselves, where and as a leader, that's the type of thing that you have a little bit of, you have less visibility into, and things like, could be chosen tech stack. Well, if one engineer, the senior engineer, chose a tech stack that nobody else on the team knows how to operate within, that's going to create a little bit of it's going to create traffic jams and slowdowns because there's one person who can help with the work that's being done. And that was probably a good decision from a technical perspective, but it has created a gating factor in our ability to be productive. And I might just see what I perceive to be a slow-moving team without having any real understanding as to why. And I think one of the big things with bottlenecks in general is the communication between the team experiencing the work and myself as a leader. Because if they know that there are certain things that are slowing them down that were my fault, it would be good for them to share that with me. I can do something about it.
Yeah. And so in your experience, then team members aren't necessarily communicating their bottlenecks to the leaders. What's your thinking on why that might be?
Well, there are a couple of different reasons. So psychological safety is a really big thing. Especially in our industry, there's a lot of burnout. There are a lot of, we all see the news about layoffs. There gets to be a point where folks are, more concerned about having like the security. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to like raise issues. If you have an environment of low psychological safety, you're not going to get some of that volunteering of problems that could be solved. So that's one area.
That's a great point. I think even if you've got the right moments or forums for people to communicate, and if they don't feel safe to be able to raise things, and it doesn't matter how many retrospectives or channels you have for that.
Yeah. And I think another common one, especially in larger organizations, is change is hard and it takes time. So if I were to raise 3 issues with you, a quarter, and none of those issues ever get addressed or resolved or acknowledged again, eventually I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop raising some of those issues that I see. So there's a little bit of learned helplessness that comes from, it's like, yeah, we have this bottleneck. If we could just fix this issue, like we would be smooth operating, but every time I raise an issue, nothing ever happens. So what's the point of me bringing it to your attention? And I think the third thing would be a lot of folks are just like, well, this is how it is. This is how I was told this process operates. So that's how I'm going to do it. If you don't have a culture where experimentation is welcome or the norm, or if you don't have a culture where a continuous improvement of process is something that is focused on, you just kind of get to a point where you accept what the status quo is and work within it.
Yeah, and I definitely have seen that in some of the larger organizations that I've worked in. I think in terms of they can almost become a bit of a complacency as well as this is, or like we have maybe tried to change or raise things before and nothing's happened. Yeah, okay, great. So I guess visibility, it kind of works both ways. What would you normally recommend for leaders and teams to put in place to help visualize bottlenecks and maybe measure the impact of them as well?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different things, and there's a book I read many years ago called "How to Measure Anything." It's a really interesting book. It's a little hard to read in one sitting 'cause it's very wordy, but it changes your brain a little bit to think about, well, what should you be measuring, and what are some ways in which you could do that? I think the easy answer is to default toward a long list of metrics, and let's take a look at the metrics and see what that's doing. I don't know that that's actually going to be too helpful because now you have analysis paralysis with like, oh, I've got 40 numbers and I don't really know what any of the numbers are
Yeah.
actually telling me to do. But in terms of like where to start, I think a big thing would be really kind of opening up that communication aspect of it, where like the people on the team feel the bottlenecks most acutely. And if you're able to kind of have that feedback loop of, what if I'm a senior leader in an organization and I'm asking you for, what is one thing we could do that would like improve your working conditions or that would like eliminate something that causes you pain, the feedback loop from hearing that, me being able to either make a change or not make a change, and then seeing the impact on the group itself, even just from an anecdotal, like team happiness perspective, so to
Hmm.
speak. That's probably where I would start with first, because it's not punitive. It can't be imagined as any sort of way of like we're being metriced to death. It's just like, let me help fix something, and let's like quantify the amount of time it actually took to identify and fix and feel the impact. That's how I would suggest starting.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, I think we've just got one question here, actually. Let's bring this up on the screen. I think this is kind of it. So, does that bring? So we're asking, what mechanisms do you suggest to spot patterns?
So there's a couple. I'll start with like a qualitative, again, fluffy human aspect of things again, which is um, if this is what your team retrospectives are for, and like being able, if something keeps popping up week over week or however frequently you run retrospectives, which you should be running, if the same kind of things keep popping up as unresolved over and over and over again, that to me is a pretty good indicator that there's something to look at that could be helped. That's not gonna be red flashing on a dashboard anywhere, but as a leader of the people, that's something that you should want to be paying attention to and looking for. There are other solutions. This is not a sales pitch for us by any means. There are a number of other companies that do engineering insights and intelligence. There are platforms out there that you can connect to your work that will show you, insights into how your group is operating. That's good to get a pulse of like, well, what does baseline look like for us, and what does, where do we have opportunities to improve? The other thing that I would recommend is if you don't have a standard practice of assessing and measuring your value stream, I would really advocate for, having the value stream mapping be an activity that is something you're looking at regularly and thinking about with your team.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Okay, great. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about standardization. So I guess not always the answer. I know a lot of people can potentially think that, especially in larger organizations as well. So the industry is filled with frameworks, consultants, silver bullets promised, etc. What are you seeing in the topic of standardization? What's your view at the minute?
Well, I used to be one of those consultants that had,
Okay. Yeah.
and our approach is a little bit different, which was, we weren't saying come in and implement safe and everything will be better. We weren't saying come in and measure DORA metrics for your organization and everything will be better. And what we were trying to do was emphasize the principles with which an organization should be making decisions. And I think when it comes to standardization, you have a really interesting challenge of scaling patterns that we know work, but also team autonomy. And as organizations move more towards the product engineering with the balanced teams, team autonomy is a really front and center concept. The more autonomous a team gets, the more other challenges you have to solve downstream. So I think that on one hand, we know everybody operating the exact same way. Like, we have data that shows that that's not effective. On the other end of the spectrum, if everybody is operating in a completely different way, we don't get to maximize economies of scale. We don't get the benefits of having like shared learning. So it's the other type of consultant answer, if it's not just do this, you'll be fine, is it really depends. And that's kind of where I sit on the state of standardization, is like, it's not all yes or all no. There's a very fuzzy gray area there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've definitely seen environments where it's worked better to set kind of principles and guidelines around things, and then make sure that you've got the right communication and channels between teams to make sure that you're sharing as well. So if something is working for a given set of teams, what would make you think twice about spreading those practices to like the rest of the organization? Oh, right, you've got a pocket of like, this is really working, this is great. And you're like, yeah, how would you do that?
Yeah, well, each team is built differently. Each team has like its own little subculture within the team of how they operate. They also have different objectives. We have, I had a conversation with a really large healthcare provider last week. They were talking about the difference between a team that's focused on keep the lights on activities versus a team that's focused on innovation. And the ways that those two teams work in order to accomplish their objectives, they're not the same. The type of personalities on those two teams are not the same. Yeah. And you may have a really effective set of practices and principles for move quick innovation type teams that would completely break the type of work you're trying to do with the keep the lights on activities. So understanding the context behind, okay, here's a practice that's working. Why is that working there? What's unique about that group of people or that circumstance that allows that practice to work? That's really important to understand, essentially the wrapper behind the practice of like, what's all of the behind the scenes action there that would help determine, can I just take that practice and apply it somewhere else? Or do I have to take the underlying principles of why that practice evolved and encourage a new practice to be developed in a different set of contexts?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point. And I've heard stories of when some teams have potentially too much autonomy, I guess, and that can create a lot of waste around the broader organizations. How should leaders think about walking the line between that autonomy and standardization piece?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of a horror story on this particular topic from my past. I was working at a company that provided database technology to customers, and we had one customer that had 4 different contracts with our company because each individual group that wanted access to our technology just reached out and got it. They were not paying the same rates. They did not get the benefit from having scales. They were not managed by a central group. So what we ended up as a leader of that organization, come renewal time or budgeting, and you see 4 separate line items for the same thing, it starts to raise questions. So that is a real problem that happens with organizations where it's kind of a free-for-all, everybody does their own thing. And in one way that organizations try to solve for that is by having like a central IT that says, you must use anything that comes through here. Like if you're going to use any type of tool, it has to be on our approved list, and it goes from there. I think everybody who has worked in central IT type setup knows that that doesn't work super well, because that's where the term shadow IT came from. People would just say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do my own thing over here.
Yeah. Can become quite, it's an additional process, can become quite complicated. You're waiting. I know from like a software engineering perspective, sometimes you need to move quite quickly on tooling or being able to get something new to help you experiment or solve a new problem. And when you've got to put that through a system that's got several sign-off points and a budget approval and the whole InfoSec piece as well.
Yes.
I mean, obviously you have to, there's trade-offs, isn't there, between how much process and governance you put in place for those things. But from an experimentation point of view, especially when you're doing that test and learn phase, when you've got those kind of processes with central IT teams, it can slow things down incredibly fast.
It can, and a pattern that I've seen work out successfully, and I think this is a topic that is pretty hot right now, is the concept of like developer experience teams or developer productivity teams, where like they're treating the engineering groups as the customer. And saying, well, what is it you're trying to do, and how can we help you do that safely? And within the catalog of what's approved and what's understood, like, tell me what it is you're trying to achieve, and I can get you set up with the stuff that you need. It is, you may argue that it is a rebranded central IT type approach, but the branding itself actually does make a difference, because we're not here to stop you from doing something. We're here to help you do what you're
enabling, isn't it? And that just that whole mindset switch of even the relationship in terms of then not feeling that you would want to create shadow infrastructure or anything. You're like, well, I know that this team's going to help me get things done.
Yeah, one of the phrases that I repeat regularly is like, how do we make the right thing to do be the easiest thing to do? And in a lot of cases, shadow IT popped up because going through the official channels, like you mentioned earlier, was hard, and it was painful, and it took a lot of time. So the DevX teams and dev productivity teams really focused on like, well, we want you to behave well. How do we make that the easier option for you to choose?
Yeah, definitely. That's great. All right, cool. Thank you. I think that's a good coverage of standardization. So what about teams? Team health, how important is that? I guess you mentioned DORA metrics earlier. Maybe you want to explain what those are, but I guess there can be a lot of quantitative tools and metrics, especially I've seen from teams outside of product and engineering wanting to see metrics, how productive are you? But how are teams measuring their health?
Yeah, I think the DORA metrics are kind of what the industry has settled on, of like, these 4 things. You must be good at these 4 things at the baseline. And for those of you that may not know DORA, there's a really large study that gets done that previously kind of identified from high performing teams. What did we notice trends in each of those, and then we kind of settled on 4 key things there. There's the mean time to recover, which is like a really big thing. Like, how quickly can we go from oops to like everything running well?
Yeah, nothing happened here.
Yeah. I'm trying to look up the definition of DORA. I think it's the DevOps research. I don't remember what the A stands for. Do you, Anna? On the
Oh, put me on the spot now. Dora metrics.
Well, the A in DORA, DevOps research and assessment is the A for DORA. But the metrics there, as I mentioned, was like the mean time to repair, how long it takes us to recover. The change failure rate, which is how often do the changes we make actually fail, and do we need to do something about? Ideally, like if you're pushing buggy code into production, you want to do that as infrequently as possible. Right? You got lead time for changes, which is the time it takes for work to get into production, and then deployment frequency is how often are you doing it. There's a balance between all of those things where if you are deploying into production really rapidly, really frequently, but you have a really high failure rate, you want to look at that to be able to make your process changes to balance those things out well. So you can look at those 4 metrics. Those are kind of baseline of what, like, if you're going to be a healthy team, you should be able to measure these things, and there are kind of industry standards there. But those 4 things by themselves are not enough to say, we have a healthy and happy engineering group. And I think that's a really important thing because we're not a factory of robots. We are they're still people on the end of the day building the software and writing the code. And you can over optimize on looking at technical measurable numbers and trying to squeeze every ounce of measurable impact out of the system. The challenge that you have with that is, like, as an individual, like, if we are just absolutely cranking it, our metrics look amazing, but I hate coming to work every day, you're going to have other impacts with me churning or leaving and you needing to hire somebody new. So you do need to consider the qualitative aspect of, is my team happy and healthy, with the quantitative aspect of, are we objectively performing well?
Yeah, definitely. And what are the kind of things that you would recommend or you've seen work well from the qualitative side of things?
Yeah, so one thing that I've instrumented in the past was, we had a team health self-assessment, not based on numbers whatsoever, but it was a self-assessment around kind of 12 different traits that the team would do quarterly. And these would be things like, I have everything I need to do my job effectively. These would be things like, I understand why I'm working on what I'm working on. Some of these more, again, not quantitative type of things, but they're check-ins within the group to be able to say, like, I'm fulfilled here. I've got everything I need to do my best work. I feel like we're supported well by our organization. Those are the types of things that at some level will impact more of the technical metrics, because if we have an unhappy team, they're not going to perform well. If you have a team that doesn't feel like they have the support of their leadership or their organization, that's going to come through in the quality of the work that goes out. So I really advocate for having a regular touch point on, you may think of this as happiness, but it has to go a step further than like a net product or a net promoter score, right? Doesn't give enough context into whether a team is happy and healthy.
Yeah. And are there tools that can help measure that? Or is this something that you've seen organizations develop themselves?
I've seen a little bit of both. I know that there are companies out there that are focused on the concept of like developer happiness. I think DX is one, but they're, at the end of the day, they may be a software solution, but it's still a survey. It's still a conversation with people, and that's one of the challenges that makes this part of measuring team health hard. is that you have to get the information from the team members. Well, if you have low psychological safety in your environment, you're not going to get honest information.
Yeah, or you get just a low response rate. People don't fill it out,
Exactly.
do they?
And then once you do have those things, well, now you have to interpret those things, and then you have to choose to take action on it. It's a lot more complicated of a machine to improve than looking at numbers on a dashboard and saying we need to make our cycle time go down. So one thing that I've been experimenting with personally has been synthesizing large sets of this information, of the qualitative information, using tools like ChatGPT or Bard to be able to say, it's like, this was the question that we asked our team of developers. Here were the 80 responses that we got. Like, what trends pop out? These types of language models are good for stuff like that and helping spot patterns, right? I still need to figure out what to do with that, but it takes that middle step of trying to sort through and synthesize information, and it just makes it a little bit easier for me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. We've got a question here about psychological safety. So I'll bring this one up. Right. How do you improve psychological safety in a situation where the team is less visible in the organization?
Well, psychological safety we could have an entire hour-long conversation just on that topic, but at the root of most organizations where I've seen that have poor psychological safety really comes down to a couple of key traits. The first is that when people raise issues, they're punished for it, or they're like they're talked down to about it, or it's very much seen the company takes a defensive posture. The second trait that I see, which is almost worse, is we say, thanks for raising that, and then it just never gets brought up again and never gets acknowledged, and we don't do anything about it. So in scenarios where there's less visibility on a specific team and they maybe don't have that feeling of psychological safety, I think as a leader of that group, it's important to not just give them opportunities to feel heard, but demonstrate that what they've said or what they're experiencing is something that gets followed back up on, regardless of how big or small the issue is. If you can start to make little deposits into the trust bank, so to speak, it doesn't matter how large the deposit is. You're just growing it from zero into the green. So improving that, as a leader, that's my number one recommendation, is to just be able to start earning some of that trust by doing the things that you say you're going to do as raised by the team.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, having worked in those kind of leadership teams, that you need to make that a priority. But it can often get that backlog of things that are for kind of team health and team happiness can often obviously get moved down the list based on business pressures and those kind of things. But I think that's counterintuitive in the long run, in terms of not building up the trust of your team, them becoming more happy, hence more productive. All of those things kind of contribute together.
Well, and Anna, one of the questions you asked at the top of this around team structures and those sorts of things, management of people is a different craft and a different skill than software engineering or product management or product design. And I think it's very common for a career ladder to say, well, you were a great individual contributor, time to be a manager. A lot of the organizations where I've seen that really do have high levels of psychological safety are because they have humans in human management positions that have that value is kind of core to how they operate, and is a skill that they have in terms of fostering those type of safe environments. So I think again, another topic we could spend a lot of time into, but the acknowledgement that being a leader of people is a craft and a skill in and of itself can go a long way to creating the foundations to have a psychologically safe environment.
Yeah, fab. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, let's move on to, we're talking about talked about happy teams. Productive engineers, I guess, does not necessarily equal positive business result. What's your kind of view on this? What do you think the main causes are?
I could talk about this for a really long time. My background coming from product management, I was working within the balance team setup. Like all of our teams, we knew exactly why we were working on what we were working on, and if we were successful, what that meant for the business. I was very fortunate to come up through the early parts of my career with that just be my experience. I knew that we were working on this particular widget for the website because we needed to increase sales of this particular set of products, and this widget was going to help us do that. That was just tied into how we prioritized work. It was tied into how we measured whether the work we were doing was effective or not. As I progressed in my career and started working with larger organizations, the levels of abstraction between user story and a backlog and impact on the business, there just became so many more levels to where like it was incredibly difficult to trace back this work that I'm doing this week, why? And if I do this really well, what does that mean for us? And the more distance there is between the work and the results, the harder it is to tie those things together. The other thing I would say about that, though, is for the types of organizations that do have big distance between business results and engineering work, they still want to measure whether engineers are doing a good job. And that's where, the concept of measuring output or developer productivity really kind of comes from. It's like, well, we can't measure if this person is improving the business, but we can measure if they're working hard. And I think that's a little bit of a vanity metric at best to be able to say, we can look at any number of developer productivity metrics and say, congratulations, we reduced cycle time quarter over quarter. But if we can't answer the question, how did that improve our business, then it's kind of like a false flag to be chasing.
Yeah, another one I've seen is around like lines of code and things like that. It's like, actually we want to promote more simplified code anyway, but also we want to be caring more about what are the things that actually delivered to in front of a customer that we can get feedback on. That's what we should be measuring.
Yeah, totally agree. And working with the US government has a very complex set of requirements that gets created. Multiple years goes into creating this big list of 1,500 requirements for a software application. And then there's you put it out to bid for a contractor to come in and say, yep, we'll build all 1,500 of those requirements. There is no feedback loop from end user to engineering team. There is no continuous learning of what we're doing.
So when sorry, I'm just mind blown about that, because those are potential really big projects. I guess it's still project rather than product development type stuff. So the actual vendor that would win that wouldn't then be working very closely with the customers on their behalf to make sure that it's the right thing.
Well, in that type of contracting model, and I should caveat, parts of the government are moving away from that. There's a big push to kind of modernize how the government contracts software, but a really large portion of it still operates in this model where success for the contractor is based off of, did all 1,500 of those things get built? It's not based on user adoption or net promoter score. It's like, did we get it done?
Is it ticks, tick, tick on the list?
Yeah, and that's not a problem that's unique to government agencies. I see this happen in a lot of cases where you have the business versus technology type setup. Technology gets the list of checkboxes, they build it, hooray, they did a good job. Organization.
I mean, I've not worked in, I've seen it where there's been these big kind of ticket item technology pieces that have been, third party, bring it in, we need to tick the box. But by the time that that's actually happened, given all the processes that you have to write an RFP or the vendor process, by the time that's actually landed, then often it's, or I've seen an example of where it's then not actually the right thing anymore, but there'd been no incremental kind of product development work done along that timeline to really assess it. And then you kind of put the users on it and like, it doesn't do what we thought it might do at the beginning. So, and it can cost a lot of money as well, those kind of projects.
I worked for a company that went out of business because our focus was on completing the checklist provided to us by a book publisher. Midway through that project, however, Apple released the iPad and iBooks, and we were building things for like elementary school textbooks to put them on the internet. And all of a sudden, the entire industry shifted towards iPads, and we were dead in the water as soon as that happens. We didn't have the ability or mindset to pivot based off of new information.
Yeah, gosh, that's a big pivot. Okay, so it's not always easy to associate direct business results with engineering work. So we talked about this a little bit, but I guess developer productivity on its own, not a good enough proxy to work from, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's, in some cases, you might say, well, it's better to measure that than nothing, right? And maybe it's better to measure that than nothing. But if you're emphasizing on developer productivity to the point where everybody's just running really fast, we're like churning out a bunch of code, we're building a lot of features, but then that entire team gets let go as part of a company-wide restructuring because we didn't hit our business results, it would probably be worth taking the time that you invested in optimizing that team productivity to making sure that we're actually understanding how that team is supposed to impact the business. And I think, the effort that you would, we're humans, we have 8 hours a day of the limited number of humans, right? So if you are going to invest that time and you have to choose between, do we measure how much output our engineers are doing, or do we try to build the bridge to understand what the work is supposed to do for the business? I would always advocate for doing that first. It's better to know what your North Star is from a outcomes perspective than it is to invest the time into measuring some of these output-based metrics. So that's, if you have limited set of time and budget, I would invest in doing that one first.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the North Star metric there. It's a framework that I've used before, and I've worked with larger organizations who are starting to use it. Is that one you'd recommend?
Absolutely. With metrics in general, it's more important to have the one right one than it is to have 40 distracting ones. And starting with the North Star metric, this is where we have to, all the folks in the canoe need to be paddling the same direction and understanding that, where our effort is going. That is worth so much to be able to do it that way. And for folks that don't have that, that kind of goes back to like the business objectives perspective. Like that North Star metric that a team should be focused on is going to be tightly related to, the bigger picture impact. I think having that one, if you don't already have a culture of measuring outcomes, I would start with the one thing there.
Yeah, I agree. And how have you seen that kind of be cascaded down in larger organizations? Because sometimes there can be a lot of layers to get through to like the actual team members that we've been talking about, like product engineering teams who are, building out the foundations for those.
Yeah, I think there's, folks are familiar with OKRs. Folks are familiar with like frameworks like OGSMs as well. The challenge with cascading things down is you can do it well, and it is a great way to go about things, but it's really easy to do poorly. And then you end up with a scenario where at some point down the cascade, you have gone from a business impact that is understood at that level to a vanity metric that a team is trying to achieve without really understanding why. So I think if you're able to look at the big picture, the entire tree, you in most cases would be able to point and say, here is where we lost it. Here's where we lost the story. Everything underneath that is is of dubious value in terms of standing alone by itself. And that goes back to the entire topic of this, which is visibility. If I'm working at one of the lower ends of the cascade tree and I don't have the visibility up the stack, I'm just operating kind of in my vacuum here without having context that can help me make better decisions that would impact the top of the tree. And being able to visualize what that cascade looks like for all levels of the organization can help folks answer the question of like, oh, okay, I see why this is at the top of my backlog. But I've worked with a number of organizations that will only publish your team's objectives and one level up. So you don't get the full span of things.
Okay.
And that's just part of corporate policy that they exist. And I would argue is like not a great corporate policy.
Yeah, definitely. Great, thank you. Well, we're 22 minutes past. We've got a few minutes for some questions, if that's okay, just before. Okay, so how do you foster innovative or going the extra mile mindset for everyone working in the team so that it elevates them from just doing my job to something that adds value?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I think this, from a leadership position, people tend to behave as they are incentivized. So if an engineer or a team member is incentivized by churning through the backlog, that is what they're going to do. If that is framed as their job, that is what they're going to do. If I'll use a retail example from my past. If the engineer views their job as increasing the sale of baseball bats, and that is what they're measured on, is like, is the work you're doing increasing the sale of baseball bats? Going above and beyond becomes, well, how do I figure out how to do that? And like, how do I arrange the backlog or modify the backlog in such a way that we are able to do that? Or here were the requirements I got, but because of what I know about the code base, I think we should not do it that way. We should do it this way. Here's why. I think a lot of it just comes down with how you frame their role here. And in a lot of cases, when you have people want to do a good job, there are very few people that wake up every day and say, I am excited to like skate by and just chill for 8 hours. Most people want to do a good job. And if you're able to frame their job in a way that aligns with the type of behaviors you'd like to see them have, then most people are going to move towards that way of operating.
Yeah, I've definitely seen it where you've been able to bring to life the purpose, and get that alignment and then that feedback loop back into teams so that they can actually understand the impact that they're having. Then they can sometimes feel more driven and more aligned to the purpose of the organization. It's like when you can see that you're making a difference, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Great. Any more questions? So I think there was another question we talked about potentially, so we can add this one because I'm interested to hear. What are you seeing regarding the remote versus return to work office situation in our industry and how that's impacting visibility?
So I will remove all of my personal perspectives on remote versus return to office, but I think there is one thing that we have observed over the past few years due to COVID is that like you can do the job remote. You can do a lot of jobs remote. The organizations who embraced it and said, oh, we're going to change how we work now because our situation has changed, they experienced a fine shift. The organizations who continue to try to operate with an in-office culture and style, except now everybody's distributed, didn't work out well. There's where you have a lot of leaders at organizations that say remote didn't work. I always want to caveat that by saying remote didn't work for you. So that's absolutely could be true. But I think there are enough proof points out there to be able to say that remote can work, provided you design the operations in a way is remote first. And that doesn't look like, just like a startup isn't a smaller version of a big company, a remote company isn't just a distributed version of an in-office company. You have to think about changing that. And for some organizations, in-office work, beneficial, absolutely. You can have an effective company that does that. But I think there's a little bit more power in the hands of the individual employees to be able to say, I want to work in an office and my company is staying remote, therefore I'm going to find a new job so that I can have the experience that I want to have. But the flip side is also true, and that's what a lot of the larger organizations are finding. Amazon saying, come back to the office, and folks are saying, no thanks, I will go find somewhere else to work.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen both. I know I've been really interested in some of GitLab's story about, how they're, putting you have to put a lot of effort into being a full remote company. It's very different, isn't it? It's not like you can just transition to remote. We're remote now and then go, oh, that didn't work. In terms of understanding how people work differently, asynchronous working, documentation there's so many factors that become a lot harder. Well, not harder, just different. Yeah. So I almost said harder. I didn't mean it. Okay. Well, thanks, Andrew. Actually, just finally, just before we wrap up, are there any takeaways that you want to kind of wrap up with at all for our listeners?
Yeah, I think as it relates to the general topic of visibility, and especially within our larger organizations, understanding what is it we're looking to see, what is it that we need to see that we can't today, and why. If you're able to start with that rather than looking at tools that are available that promise get visibility into your organization, you'll be able to see these 40 things. If you're not able to answer the question of what is it that we're missing visibility into, and what would be different for us if we had that visibility? If you can start with that point, then you may be able to find a number of different ways to achieve that. But then a key part of the visibility piece is, and I think this would probably be my number one takeaway of this, is a lot of it is qualitative. And if you don't have the type of communication cadences or the type of safe environment where that communication and information flows effectively, then visibility will continue to be a problem at the organization. And so solving for those two things I would consider to be table stakes for addressing the broader visibility challenge.
Right, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And thank you very much for joining us for this discussion today. I've really enjoyed it. Just for everybody around CTO Craft and the events, obviously it's Christmas, so everybody's taking a little bit of a break, but the next Bytes event will be on the 25th of January. And that's talking about what does culture mean now. So I think the link's been shared in the chat. Sign up for that. Also got Andrew's details in the chat. If you want to connect with him on LinkedIn, please do. And I think that's everything. I think we've covered everything. So have a lovely Christmas, everybody. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I hope you make it safely home from New York this week.
Thank you.